In the quaint, sun-dappled streets of Willow Creek, life moved with a serene predictability. Margaret, with her soft auburn hair often tied in a loose bun, had found solace in this small town's embrace. She loved her home, a charming cottage with a blooming garden, shared with her husband. Mark, a tall man with a gentle demeanor and kind eyes, worked as an architect. His love for Margaret was a quiet, steady flame. Their marriage, though brief, was built on mutual respect and a deep sense of companionship. One bright Saturday morning, as Margaret hummed to herself while tending to her roses, a car pulled up. A figure stepped out, his laughter reaching her before she saw his face. It was Michael, Mark's best friend from college, visiting after years abroad. He was the opposite of Mark, more rugged with a mischievous sparkle in his blue eyes. "Margaret," Michael called out, his voice warm like the summer air. "It's been ages. You haven't changed a bit." Margaret smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Michael, welcome. It's so good to see you. Mark's talked so much about your adventure." As they walked towards the house, Michael's charm was undeniable. He was animated, sharing stories, his laughter infectious. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in months. During lunch, Mark watched his wife and best friend with a contented smile. "I'm glad you two are hitting it off," he said, passing a dish to Michael. Michael grinned. "How could I not? Your wife is amazing, Mark. You're a lucky man." Margaret blushed, brushing off the compliment. But somewhere deep down, a long-forgotten part of her heart fluttered. As the days passed, Michael became a regular visitor. He brought a new energy into their home, his presence almost too vibrant to ignore. Margaret found herself looking forward to his visits. They talked about everything, from books to travel to dreams they dared not voice before. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Michael turned to her, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "Margaret, you know, you're incredible. Mark's a great guy, but sometimes I wonder if he truly sees just how extraordinary you are." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She looked away, the sky's hues mirrored in her tumultuous thoughts. "Thank you, Michael," she whispered, a mix of happiness and unease knotting in her stomach. It was then, in that moment of shared silence, that the first seed of something unspoken and dangerous was planted. Margaret felt it, a stirring in her soul, unexpected and unsettling. It was a feeling she couldn't quite name, a flicker of something beyond friendship, beyond the safe walls of her marriage to Mark. As the days slipped into weeks, Margaret's thoughts increasingly wandered to Michael. His visits were the highlights of her otherwise routine days. She caught herself laughing more, feeling more alive. It wasn't just his stories or his charm. It was the way he saw her, really saw her, in a way she hadn't felt seen in a long time. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Michael turned the conversation to his travels. "You know, Margaret, I've seen so many places, met so many people. But it's rare to find someone who truly resonates with your soul. It's like finding a piece of home in someone." Margaret met his gaze, her heart fluttering. "That sounds beautiful, Michael. It must be a wonderful feeling." Michael's eyes held hers, intense and searching. "It is. And sometimes you find that piece of home in the most unexpected places." The air between them was charged, a silent acknowledgement of something more than friendship. Margaret's mind raced with confusion and excitement. She knew she was treading on dangerous ground, yet part of her didn't want to step back. That night, Margaret lay awake, Mark's steady breathing beside her, a reminder of the life she had chosen. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, filled with images of Michael, his words echoing in her heart. She felt torn, caught between the safety of her marriage and the exhilarating unknown that might. As she drifted into a restless sleep, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. The unforeseen stirrings in her heart were a prelude to a journey filled with passion, confusion, and the quest for true happiness. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the living room where Margaret sat, a photo album open in her lap. It was an evening like many others, yet the silence of the house echoed louder than usual. Mark was away on a business trip, and Margaret found herself lost in the sea of memories that the pictures evoked. Her fingers traced the edges of a photograph taken on her first wedding day. The smile on her younger face seemed forced, a stark contrast to the genuine happiness she had felt on the day she married Mark. The pain of her first marriage, marked by betrayal and heartbreak, rushed back to her. She had been so naive, so eager to believe in a love that was never meant to last. As she turned the page, her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Michael, his presence now a familiar comfort in her life. "Hey, Margaret, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check on you." "Mark mentioned you'd be alone tonight," Michael said, stepping inside. Margaret managed a smile. "Thanks, Michael. It's always good to see you." They settled in the living room, and Margaret couldn't help but feel a sense of ease in his company. Michael noticed the photo album and pointed to a picture. "Is that from your first wedding?" Margaret sighed, closing the album. "Yes, it's a part of my life I rarely revisit. My first husband. He wasn't faithful. It left me broken for a long time." Michael's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I can't imagine how hard that must have been." Margaret looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was. But then I met Mark. He helped me believe in love again. Our marriage. Michael reached out, placing his hand over hers. "Mark is a good man." "You both..." Margaret met his gaze, her heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Yes, he is. But sometimes I wonder if I rushed into marrying him out of fear of being alone." The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging in the air. Michael squeezed her hand gently. "Margaret, it's okay to have doubts. What matters is how you feel now." Margaret hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. I care for him deeply. He's my best friend. But I'm not sure if that's the same as being in love." Michael nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Love is complicated. But you deserve to be happy, Margaret. Don't settle for anything less." As Michael left that night, Margaret felt a mix of relief and turmoil. His words echoed in her mind, stirring questions she had long buried. She realized that marriage to Mark, while comfortable and safe, lacked the passion and depth she yearned for. The realization frightened her, but it also awakened a part of her that craved something more. Lying in bed, Margaret replayed her conversation with Michael. His empathy, his understanding, it touched her in a way she hadn't expected. She found herself comparing the way Michael listened to her, his eyes always holding hers, to It was unfair, she knew, but the thoughts persisted. Her mind wandered back to her first marriage, the lies, the deceit, the way her trust had been shattered. She had vowed never to let herself be so vulnerable again. Yet here she was, opening up to Michael in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. Margaret turned off the bedside lamp, the darkness enveloping her. She realized that her past was not just a series of events to be forgotten, but a part of her that shaped her desires and fears. As she drifted to sleep, she knew that her journey wasn't just about finding love, but also about understanding herself and what she truly needed to feel whole and full. The autumn leaves swirled around Margaret's feet as she walked through the garden, her mind a tangled web of thoughts. Mark was away again, his job demanding more of his time. In his absence, the house felt larger, emptier. Yet, there was an anticipation in the air, a sense of something impending, something she couldn't quite place. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Michael. "Hey, Margaret, I'm heading over to the farmer's market. Thought you might like to join." His voice was casual, but there was an undercurrent of something more. Margaret hesitated for a moment. "Sure, Michael, that sounds nice." As they walked through the market, the air was filled with the scents of fresh produce and the sounds of lively chatter. Margaret found herself laughing, the heaviness in her heart lifting momentarily. "You seem different today, lighter," Michael observed, handing her a bunch of sunflowers. Margaret smiled, accepting the flowers. "Maybe it's just the change of scenery, or maybe it's your company." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. There was an unspoken acknowledgement of the growing connection between them. Back at Margaret's home, they decided to cook dinner together. The kitchen was filled with the warmth of the oven and the sound of their laughter. As they moved around each other, there was an ease, a rhythm to their actions. While chopping vegetables, Michael glanced over at Margaret. "You know, being with you, it feels right. Like this is where I'm supposed to be." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She looked up, her eyes locking with his. "Michael, He stepped closer, his hand gently touching her arm. "I know, Margaret, but it's hard to ignore how I feel about you, how we feel about each other." Their faces were inches apart, the tension palpable. And then, in a moment of weakness, their lips met in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with years of unspoken longing. The kiss broke, leaving them both breathless. Guilt washed over Margaret instantly. "Michael, we can't. I'm married to Mark, your friend." Michael stepped back, his expression torn. "I know, and I'm sorry. It's just being around you, I feel alive. But you're right, we can't do this to Mark." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. They finished cooking, ate in silence, the air thick with unspoken words and suppressed emotions. As Michael left, he paused at the door. "Margaret, whatever happens, I want you to know that you mean more to me than just a friend." Margaret watched him leave, her heart heavy with confusion and guilt. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As she sat alone in the kitchen, the reality of her actions hit her. She had jeopardized her marriage, her friendship, everything she held dear, for a moment of forbidden passion. The night stretched on, and Margaret was left to ponder the consequences of the dance she had unknowingly begun, a dance that threatened to unravel the very fabric of her life. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the kitchen where Margaret sat, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. The events of the previous night with Michael replayed in her mind, each moment a sharp pang of guilt and confusion. Lost in thought, she didn't hear Mark come in. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, a gesture that once brought comfort, now filled her with a sense of unease. "Morning, love. You're up early," he said, kissing her cheek. Margaret forced a smile, turning to face him. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark, sensing something amiss, sat down beside her. "Is everything okay, Margaret?" She looked into Mark's trusting eyes, a wave of sorrow washing over her. "I'm just tired, that's all. Don't worry about me." The day passed with a heaviness in the air. Margaret's mind was a battleground, torn between her loyalty to Mark and the undeniable connection she felt with Michael. She loved Mark. She did, but it was a love born of friendship and comfort, not the passionate love she now realized she yearned for. In the evening, as they sat in the living room, Mark's phone rang. It was Michael, inviting them to a small gathering he was hosting. Mark, unaware of the turmoil in Margaret's heart, accepted cheerfully. At Michael's place, the atmosphere was lively, but Margaret felt like she was in a daze. Michael's gaze kept meeting hers, a silent conversation in every look. As the night wore on, she found herself alone with Michael in the kitchen. "Margaret," Michael began, his voice low, about last night. She cut him off, her voice shaking. "We can't talk about it, Michael. It was a mistake. I'm married to Mark, your friend. We have to forget it happened." Michael reached out, but then hesitated and pulled back. "I know. I respect that. But it's hard, Margaret. I can't just switch off how I feel about you." Margaret felt tears welling up. Neither can I. But we have to. They stood in silence, the unspoken truth hanging heavily between them. Margaret knew what she had to do. She had to preserve her marriage, even if it meant burying her feelings for Michael. Later that night, as she lay beside Mark, she realized the depth of her heart's dilemma. She was living a lie, pretending to be content in a marriage that lacked the passion she now craved. The realization was both freeing and terrifying. She had to make a choice. To stay in the safety of her marriage or to follow her heart, even if it meant walking into the unknown. As the clock ticked on, Margaret understood that no matter what choice she made, there would be consequences. She was at a crossroads, each path leading to a different future, each choice a step in. Margaret turned to Mark, who was sleeping peacefully beside her. She watched him for a long time, her heart aching with love and guilt. He had been her rock, her safe harbor in the stormy seas of life. Yet, now she felt adrift, torn between the life she had and the life she yearned for. In the quiet of the night, Margaret made a silent vow to herself. She would find a way to resolve the turmoil within her heart. She couldn't let this dilemma consume her, nor could she ignore the feelings that had been awakened. She had to confront her reality, no matter how painful it might be. With this resolve, Margaret finally drifted off to sleep, her dreams a mix of fear, hope, and the echoing whispers of a heart torn between two loves. Margaret sat at the breakfast table, her eyes unfocused, staring at the morning newspaper without really reading it. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a byproduct of her inner turmoil and the secrets she harbored. Mark entered the kitchen, his footsteps echoing more loudly than usual in the quiet room. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from Margaret, his brows furrowed in concern. "You've been quiet these past few days, Margaret. Is everything okay?" Mark's voice was gentle, tinged with worry. Margaret looked up, meeting his gaze. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind, I guess," she replied, her voice a careful mask of normalcy. Mark reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? We're in this together." Margaret forced a smile, nodding. "I know, Mark, and I appreciate it. It's just some old stuff I need to work through." As the days passed, Mark's suspicions grew. He noticed the lingering looks between Margaret and Michael, the awkward pauses in conversation, the unexplained tension that seemed to hover in the air. He wanted to trust Margaret, to believe in the strength of their marriage, but doubt was a persistent shadow in his mind. One evening, while Margaret was in the shower, Mark's curiosity got the better of him. He picked up her phone just to glance through, but stopped short, his heart racing. It felt wrong, an invasion of her privacy, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Margaret, towel wrapped and fresh from her shower, walked into the bedroom to find Mark holding her phone. Their eyes met, and a silent question hung between them. "Mark, what are you doing?" Margaret's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a protective instinct kicking in. Mark looked away, placing the phone down. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I shouldn't have. It's just that I feel like there's something you're not telling me." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her heart pounding. "Mark, He interrupted, his voice tinged with desperation. "Is it Michael? Is there something going on between you two?" Margaret's mind raced. Admitting the truth could shatter everything, but lying felt like a betrayal too far. "No, Mark, there's nothing going on. But I can't deny that we've become good friends." Mark studied her face, searching for the truth behind her words. "Just friends. Just friends," she repeated, though the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Mark nodded, though his eyes still held a trace of doubt. "I trust you, Margaret. I don't want to lose you." The conversation ended there, but the seed of doubt had been planted. In the days that followed, Margaret saw the change in Mark. He was more attentive, more present. Yet there was a wariness in his eyes, a fear of losing something. Margaret felt trapped in a web of her own making. Her heart ached for the pain she was causing Mark and for the feelings she had for Michael that refused to be silenced. She was living a lie, and it was tearing her apart. As she lay in bed that night, listening to Mark's even breathing, Margaret realized the gravity of her situation. Her unspoken suspicions, the ones she had been denying, were now out in the open, casting a shadow over her marriage. She needed to make a decision, to confront the truth of her heart before it was too late. In the stillness of the night, Margaret made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to resolve the turmoil within her, to be honest with Mark and with herself. She couldn't let this uncertainty continue. It was unfair to all of them, to Mark, to Michael, and most of all, to herself. With this resolve, Margaret closed her eyes, hoping for a solution to emerge from the chaos of her thoughts, a way to navigate the complex web of emotions and choices that lay ahead. The morning light streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the breakfast table where Margaret sat, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. The air was thick with unspoken words, a tension that had been building for weeks. Mark sat opposite her, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a solemnity that was uncharacteristic. He took a deep breath, his gaze meeting Margaret's. "Margaret, we need to talk." Margaret's heart sank. She had known this moment was inevitable, yet facing it filled her with dread. "Yes, Mark. I know." Mark leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I can't shake the feeling that something's changed between us. Ever since Michael came into our lives, I feel like I'm losing you." Margaret felt a lump in her throat. The truth that she had been trying to ignore was now staring her in the face. "Mark, Before she could continue, Mark interrupted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Are you in love with him, Margaret? Is that why things have been so different?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. The honesty she had been withholding now demanded to be released. "Mark, I never meant for this to happen. But yes, there are feelings between Michael and me. Feelings that I didn't expect and don't fully understand." The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging heavily in the air. Mark's face was a mix of hurt, disbelief, and betrayal. "How long, Margaret? How long have you felt this way?" "It's not about time, Mark. It's about something missing in us that I didn't even realize until recently," Margaret said, her voice breaking. Mark stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "I thought we were happy, Margaret. I thought what we had was real." "It was real, Mark. It is real. But it's different. I care about you so much, but it's not the same as what I feel for Michael." "I'm so sorry," Margaret reached out. But Mark stepped. "I need some time to think about all this," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. He walked out of the room, leaving Margaret alone with her shattered illusions. The days that followed were a blur of heartache and confusion. Margaret moved through them like a ghost, her mind replaying the moment she had confessed to Mark over. Eventually, Mark approached her. "Margaret, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I can't be in a marriage where I'm not the one you want. I deserve more than that. We both do." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand, Mark. I never wanted to hurt you. You've been nothing but good to me." As they decided to separate, Margaret felt as though a part of her was being torn away. But amidst the pain, there was also a sense of relief. The truth was out, and with it came a chance for a new beginning for both of them. In the quiet aftermath, Margaret pondered the journey ahead. She had stepped into the unknown, leaving behind the comfort of her marriage for a chance at a love that burned brighter, yet was fraught with uncertainty. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, filled with self-discovery and difficult choices. As she packed her belongings, Margaret realized that this was not just an end, but also a beginning of a journey towards understanding her own heart and desires, towards a future where she could be true to herself. She looked around the house one last time, each room echoing with memories of laughter, love, and now loss. With a heavy heart, she closed the door behind her, stepping out into a new chapter of her life, one where the illusions of the past were shattered, but the hope for the future remained. Margaret sat on a bench in the quiet park, the gentle rustle of leaves and distant chatter providing a soothing backdrop to her tumultuous thoughts. The evening air was cool, a stark contrast to the warmth of the emotions swirling within her. As she gazed at the setting sun, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, she reflected on the events of the past months. The end of her marriage to Mark had been amicable yet heart-wrenching. They had parted ways with tears and words of gratitude for the years they shared. Michael had been a constant presence, a source of comfort, yet also a reminder of the complexity of her choices. As she pondered her future, she heard footsteps approaching. "Margaret," Michael called softly, sitting beside her on the bench. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the myriad emotions she felt. "Michael, I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything." Michael took her hand, his voice gentle. "I know this hasn't been easy for you. I've been here waiting, hoping, but also understanding the enormity of what you've been through." Margaret sighed, squeezing his hand. "Michael, you've been a light in my life when I needed it most. But I need to find myself again, to understand who I am outside of my marriage, outside of this." Michael nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. "I get it, Margaret. I'll be here, whatever you decide. I just want you to be happy with or without me." Margaret smiled, a tear rolling down her cheek. "Thank you, Michael. That means more to me than you'll ever know." They sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky darkening to a deep blue. Margaret knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges and self-discovery. She had stepped out of the safety of her known life into a world of new possibilities. "Whatever happens, Michael," Margaret spoke, her voice resolute yet soft. "I need to walk this path on my own for a while. I need to find out who Margaret is when she's not someone's wife or someone's love interest." Michael squeezed her hand in support. "And I'll be cheering for you every step of the way." As night fell, Margaret stood up, ready to leave. She looked at Michael, her heart full of gratitude and affection, yet also determined to forge her own path. "Goodbye, Michael. Not forever, just for now," she said, a sense of hope in her voice. "Goodbye, Margaret." "I'll be waiting," he replied, his words a promise of a future, whatever it may hold. Margaret walked away from the bench, from Michael, her steps light yet firm. She was at a crossroads, her heart open to the journey ahead. A journey not just towards love, but towards self-acceptance, independence, and the endless possibilities that life had to offer. What would you do if you were Margaret?